What is up, everybody? Welcome to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be talking very in depth about the new Fiendsmith cards. This is a video I've been wanting to make about like 2 weeks ago or something. I do realize I'm a little bit late to the party, but I figured the Fiendsmith cards are going to be relevant for Yu-Gi-Oh for a relatively long time, so I still wanted to make it. We're going to be talking through some of the Fiendsmith combos, what makes these cards so powerful, maybe what you can do against these cards as well. Let's hop right in. The Fiendsmith cards obviously are already everywhere in the format, so I'm just going to quickly go through and explain what makes these cards so powerful. Very simple. This card from your hand to add a Fiendsmith spell trap from your deck to your hand, and you can revive it from the graveyard by shuffling back a light fiend from your grave into the deck or extra deck. The spell you search with this is almost always Fiendsmith Tract, which is a very good card even outside of the Fiendsmith deck in some other decks. Lets you add a light fiend monster from your deck to your hand, and then you discard a card. You can also banish it from the graveyard to perform a fusion summon of a Fiendsmith fusion monster by using material from your hand or field. This card is typically being played as a one-of at the moment, but you could play more copies of it. And the card that makes this all tick, funnily enough, is a very old card, and it's Fabled Lurry, because if this card is discarded, you summon it, and it's a fiend, light. So this turns Fiendsmith Tract into a special summon, basically. Why is it so good to have a light fiend on the board? Well, because the deck has a link 1, which is Fiendsmith Requiem. It's just any light fiend monster and lets you, as a quick effect, tribute itself to summon out a Fiendsmith Engraver from your deck, and has the effect to equip itself from the graveyard to a Fiendsmith monster. Then we got a link 2 as well, which is Fiendsmith Sequence, which lets you fusion summon by shuffling material from your graveyard into the deck, as well as letting itself equip from the graveyard to one of your Fiendsmith monsters and making that untargetable. And then the deck also obviously has fusion monsters, which is Fiendsmith's Lacrima, which requires 2 light fiend monsters and lets you summon a Fiendsmith from graveyard or banished on summon, which is non-targeting, and both of these are level 6s, so this is where, you know, all the Beatrice stuff comes in. Also, when sent to the graveyard, you can shuffle back a light fiend monster to burn your opponent for 1200, which is obviously something that in the NAWCQ and EUWCQ metagame has been a menace to deal with when it gets closer to time on the round. The fact that this deck can not only combo but also inflict burn damage very easily is obviously very hard to deal with. On top of all that, you've got Fiendsmith's Desiree, the Engraver, plus 2 light fiend monsters, and lets you negate the effects of face-up cards on the field up to the link rating of cards that are equipped to this card. The most common way you will see this card is equipped with a Fiendsmith Sequence, making it untargetable and letting you target 2 cards on the field and negating them. This is a very powerful form of effect negation because it is not a quote-unquote omni-negate like Baron the Fleur, so it can't negate stuff like Nibiru, but it can negate cards that are in an earlier point of the chain. For example, if your opponent activates a Dark Ruler no more, that is something you can never negate with Baron the Fleur. But in this instance, if you can chain another, let's say, spell trap effect to Dark Ruler, you can then respond with this, negating their Dark Ruler. And this is also non-targeting. So these are the relevant Fiendsmith cards. Honorable mention for Fiendsmith Sanct. As long as you control no face-up monsters or only light fiends, you get to summon a Fiendsmith token, and you can only attack with fiend monsters for the rest of the turn. This card can be used and has been used in some other decks just as another way to get into your Fiendsmith engine, because obviously getting that light fiend token lets you go into Requiem and so on and so forth. Not typically used in the meta Fiendsmith decks at the moment, Yubel and Snake Eye, but in some other decks like the Magical Musketeer Fiendsmith deck uses this card, for example. It's a good card still, just overshadowed by the sheer quality of the other cards. And also an honorable mention to obviously Necroquip Princess and Aerial Eater, the 2 TCG exclusive fusions, which make this engine even more powerful and versatile in different decks. You know, we've seen Yubel decks and others make great use of Aerial Eater because Sequence can fusion summon those as well. You can send fiend monsters from your deck to the graveyard to then revive them and so on and so forth. And Necroquip Princess obviously also has niche use cases, which we'll talk about. Okay, I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with the Fiendsmith cards at this point. Let's just quickly go through like why these cards are so powerful in multiple ways, right? The first thing I want to go through is just the standard, like, what if you draw this card? You know, how much does this one card do? Just as an example, right? You'd pitch the Engraver to the graveyard to search your deck for a Fiendsmith Tract. You activate Fiendsmith Tract, searching Fabled Lurry, discarding Fabled Lurry, and then Lurry will revive itself from the graveyard, leaving you with a light fiend monster on the field that you can then link off into a Fiendsmith Requiem, which you would then tribute to summon out an Engraver from your deck. So far, all you've done is basically summon a light fiend Engraver onto your board, but you have filled your graveyard with a significant amount of light fiends, letting you activate the Engraver, shuffling back one of these 2, I don't think it matters, to the deck to summon itself back. You also already have the option to equip the Requiem to one of your Fiendsmiths, and then used its effect, which is send an equipped card and a monster your opponent controls to the graveyard, which is obviously very useful going second, but if you're just going first and comboing, that's not relevant. But it leaves you with 2 Light Fiends on the board, which you can then link off into a Fiendsmith sequence. And Fiendsmith sequence now lets you fusion summon, and here you have 2 options. It depends what kind of deck you're using. If you are trying to combo as hard as possible, the standard thing you do is you shuffle back these 2 to bring back Lacrima, and then Lacrima brings out the Fiendsmith Engraver. And here you have a bunch of different options depending on what deck you're playing. In the context of, for example, Fiendsmith Snake Eye, here you would choose like, oh, do I already have my Snake Eye Ash or Diabell Star in hand? Do I already have combo? In this case, you can just turn these cards into an Appaloosa. So basically, one Fiendsmith can translate into a 3 material Appaloosa without using your normal summon. You can also overlay these 2 into a Beatrice if you don't have access to your Snake Eye cards, or in any other deck this works as well. You can use the Beatrice here to send, for example, Snake Eye Ash, then make Promethean Princess and revive it. Obviously, you can also just use the Beatrice as an endboard piece. You also have the option, because Beatrice is rumored to be banned on the next ban list. Obviously, everyone is guessing that because of how powerful the Fiendsmith cards make this card. You still would have the option to make a High King Caesar here to also protect yourself from Nibiru, but keep the sequence body to do further comboing with, and just sit on that Caesar, which is obviously also an incredible end board piece, right? Very easy access to these 3 cards on your first turn is what makes drawing the Fiendsmith so powerful. We are not locking ourselves into anything, and we are also not using our normal summon, so it's very, very simple to use these cards in all kinds of decks, right? But if we are in this situation here with these 3 cards in the graveyard and the sequence on the field, we also have the option to simply shuffle all 3 back into the deck to summon a Fiendsmith Desiree, right? Now, this is obviously something that would not play well into Nibiru, so that's what Snake Eye does when they start with the Snake Eye combo and then pivot into Fiendsmith later. We'll talk about that in a second. Fiendsmith sequence, summoning Desiree, and then you would link off the Fiendsmith sequence alongside some other bodies. It goes to the graveyard. You can then equip it to the Desiree, and there you go. You have your Desiree that can negate 2 cards. Also, if Desiree gets sent to the graveyard, you can also target a card on the field and send it to the graveyard by shuffling another Light Fiend into the deck from your graveyard. So this is another thing that you notice. All of these cards have very powerful effects by shuffling back the Fiendsmith engine into the extra deck, leading to an engine that you only need to play 1 copy of each, but basically still have access to every single turn, because all of these cards will continuously be shuffled back into your extra deck by just using the Fiendsmith effects, right? Not only does it have incredible like starter potential, extender potential, and also adds crazy good cards to your end board, but it also is basically a lot of recursion and an engine that gives you a lot of value on every single turn. That being said, the probably most powerful way that people use these cards is not even by drawing the engraver, and that's the crazy thing, right? You just saw me perform a crazy combo with 1 card that didn't even require my normal summon, but I think the best part about these cards is that you don't need to draw them. That is because Moon of the Closed Heaven also was released in Infinite Forbidden, and this card is the first generic Light Fiend Link 2 monster. What this means is that, and let's do another practical example, if you have been hand-trapped twice in your Snake Eye deck, for example, and you're stuck with these 2 cards, which in previous formats, this would probably just be an SP Little Knight pass situation. What you can do now is you can link these 2 bodies off, and this goes for any deck, by the way. This is not something exclusive to Snake Eye. This is something that even the Memento deck that Vlad used to top the EUWCQ, for example, those kind of decks at some point during their combos, not even necessarily when they're interrupted, also just like as normal parts of their combos, you can just use 2 extra bodies to make Moon of the Closed Heaven. You link Moon of the Closed Heaven into Fiendsmith's Requiem. You go Fiendsmith Requiem effect, summon out Fiendsmith Engraver, and here the only thing that you need to do somehow is get this Fiendsmith Engraver into the graveyard to be able to make sequence and so on and so forth. One simple thing you can do is equip it with the Requiem and then summon out the Necroquip Princess. And now the Fiendsmith Engraver is in the graveyard. You can shuffle back a Light Fiend. Let's say you shuffle back Moon of the Closed Heaven to bring back the Engraver. This is already a rank 6 play on its own. So you can go for a Beatrice, you can go for a Caesar, you can go whatever you want. But you also, if you just have 1 extra body, you just don't even need to go into the Necroquip Princess. You can link these 2 off now, because sequence actually just requires 2 monsters, including a Light Fiend. The other monster can be whatever, right? And so if you have a way to link this Engraver off into a sequence, you can use the sequence to shuffle these 2 back, or shuffle all 3 for Desiree. We're basically in the same spot that we were in earlier, right? This is basically the bread and butter of why these Fiendsmith cards are so powerful, because not only are they very, very good in terms of just like a one card combo, right? Like you use Fiendsmith Engraver as a starter or as extender is already pretty phenomenal use of the card. The fact that you can also access them with Moon of the Closed Heaven in basically any board state where you have two bodies on the field, right? Very reminiscent of Nightmare Mermaid and the Nightmare Phoenix and Cerberus back in the day, right? This is very comparable to that. They also add incredible potential to your combos. Like not only do they make it easier to play through hand traps because of what you can do with these cards, they also add incredible end board pieces, right? Like Desiree. If you already have combo, there's infinite ways you can send crazy good cards with Beatrice to the graveyard to make use of them. Even Wave King High Caesar. The Snake Eye deck doesn't even use this card, but it still is. It's incredibly powerful, right? The fact that this engine, even if Beatrice were to get banned, can summon out a Wave High King Caesar so easily is incredibly powerful. Obviously, this is the bread and butter stuff. If you've been playing and practicing for the EUWCQ or NEWCQ, you're familiar with all these things I just showed you. Let's dive a little bit deeper into what there is to do about these cards and maybe how they're going to impact the game moving forward, because obviously the August Forbidden Unlimited list is set to, or everyone is hoping that it will deal with the Snake Eye deck at the very minimum, but also people are expecting a hit to Yubel and so on and so forth, right? The Fiendsmith cards, personally, I don't expect to be going anywhere, simply because what they are doing right now at full power is not what they even need to do to be meta relevant. Like these cards will be meta relevant even if Beatrice gets banned, even if Appaloosa gets banned, even if they do something more drastic to the Fiendsmith engine itself. Everyone is saying like it's obviously too early to hit cards like Engraver because that card is a very expensive secret rare and just came out, which I agree with. I don't think that's going to happen. Cards like Fabled Lurie or Moon of the Closed Heaven, which is obviously also very new, but it's a common, so we've seen them hit commons relatively early. Remember the Super Heavy Samurai cards, right? So they didn't hit those cards directly, but they hit that engine, that deck relatively fast. Moon of the Closed Heaven is a candidate, I think, but even without this, obviously the Fiendsmith cards would still see play because they are still incredible draws. Even if you can't pivot into the engine with any two bodies on the board, you would, I think, still play the cards because they are incredibly powerful. Fabled Lurie is another thing that, like, it's a very old card, and it's very interesting how this card makes Fiendsmith Tract so much more powerful than it maybe was meant to be. Fiendsmith Tract being an extender special summon instead of a normal summon is something that maybe makes them consider hitting Fabled Lurie. I don't know, but even if they do, it still has a lot of power and a lot of staying power in the format, especially because they do get more support in Rage of the Abyss, which is the next set, has already been released in the OCG and is coming to the TCG in a couple of months, where they're getting a Link 3 monster and they're getting a new main deck monster, which basically lets you send a Fiendsmith card from the deck to the graveyard on summon, which is pretty neat because you can just load up the graveyard with more light fiends for your fusion summoning and so on and so forth. It basically is going to replace the need of Necroquip Princess, I think, altogether if you want to play this card in your main deck, because the only reason you use Necroquip Princess is because if you summon out an Engraver with Requiem, you need to get it to the graveyard. So what you can do instead is you can Requiem summon this and then just send the Engraver from the deck to the graveyard. So you still have the Light Fiend on the board, but you already have the Engraver in the grave to bring it back to go into sequence. This is basically just going to make the cards even better. The Link 3 is not that powerful, thankfully, but there's definitely a bright future for the Fiendsmith cards. Let's talk about some things that maybe you can do or that are possible ways to approach this and how they interact with certain non-engine that people are playing, right? The obvious thing to talk about, because that's something that's very common in Yu-Gi-Oh right now, how you interact with certain hand traps against these cards. The Fiendsmith one-card combo doesn't really do that much against one hand trap. For example, if you hold an Imperm or a Veiler, you can hit them at the point where they go into sequence and try to fuse into, let's say, Lacrima to bring back another body. The problem is with how these cards are being used in the metagame right now, your opponent could have just chosen to start with this combo to make an early Appaloosa, because they are holding a Diabellstar or a Snake Eye Ash in their hand in order to just keep pushing through your hand traps. And so the Fiendsmith engine has traded for your Imperm. They still got a sequence on the field, which is a body they can make use of later, right? That's already half of an Appaloosa. In the example of the Snake Eye deck, but this is technically true for every deck in the game that's playing these cards, it just gives these decks more pushes and very efficient pushes at that. So when it comes to these cards, they don't necessarily beat these cards. They are not necessarily insane against these cards, but they are just very efficient efficient, and you don't lose much by trying to go for the Fiendsmith combo. If your opponent has an imperm, you haven't lost your normal summon, you are not locked into anything, right? You haven't risked much either. The same is true for Nibiru. The deck can get Nibiru'd. Like if you only have Engraver and your opponent has Nibiru, your opponent is probably going to be fine. Once again, using Nibiru on one card that didn't even take their normal summon is obviously very dangerous. The same goes for any single one hand trap, right? Like the Fiendsmith cards, they don't instantly win against hand traps. They just make the statistics go very much in your favor if you're playing the Fiendsmith cards, because the chance that you can now outplay the number of hand traps that your opponent has is incredibly high, right? Like before Infinite Forbidden, it was like if you drew 2 hand traps against Snake Eyes, if they didn't have specifically Ash, Diabellstar, and Bonfire for Poplar, then usually 2 hand traps was fine, right? And against the Fiendsmith cards, that just gives them more copies of all those possible starters / extenders. So now the chance that they pass to 2 hand traps is a lot lower. Also considering the fact that they can turn 2 bodies into Closed Moon and keep playing that way. Even if they don't end on full combo, they still end on a decent bit. Bystials in theory are great against the Fiendsmith cards because they are very reliant on obviously loading the graveyard up with light fiends. There's 2 problems. The first thing is that the Lacrima Revive does not target. If it did, a Bystial would actually quite a lot stronger against this. The other problem is that the fusion summon is also very generic, and usually what they will do is the standard setup we saw earlier was going into a sequence while you have 3 light fiends in the graveyard, right? And this is a point where you can't really Bystial efficiently, because no matter what you Bystial, they will still at least be able to fuse. If they go sequence effect and you banish the Requiem, they can still make a Lacrima. They won't be able to revive with that Lacrima, but they've still created 3 bodies, which can be very annoying. Also, most of their effects shuffle back for cost, so it's hard to interact with that. Like for example, a Bystial also cannot prevent the Lacrima burn when it's close to time, because when the Lacrima hits the graveyard, it shuffles back as cost to burn for 12. They still have great uses in the long run. For example, using a Bystial to banish the sequence when they try to equip it to Desiree can be very powerful. The problem and the thing that you need to realize with this is that you're still trading 1 card in your hand for 1 card in your opponent's hand, which is the Engraver, and they still end on a lot. So Bystials are usually solid against this deck, but they obviously won't win you the game on their own, right? Because they still have an engine next to it. And that's the thing. That is one of my main, I want to say, critique points with the Fiendsmith cards is if this was all the deck was doing, I'd probably be fine with it. Like if Fiendsmith was in some way, shape, or form contained in its own archetype, in its own deck, it'd be powerful, but it'd be fine, because if you had ways to deal with these Fiendsmith cards, you'd probably be okay. But the way these cards are so splashable and played in hybrids all the time, right? I think that's what they're meant for, but I just personally find that the most frustrating part. It's never the main thing that your opponent is trying to do. It's always a bonus. So whatever kind of hand trap you're throwing at the Fiendsmith cards, it just feels like you're dealing with the bonus stuff of your opponent's deck, right? You're not dealing with the main core, right? You're not dealing with the Snake Eye combo. You're not dealing with the Yubel combo. You're not dealing with even the Memento combo. You're dealing with the Fiendsmith part of their deck, which then makes sure that the other part that actually wins them the game will resolve, right? But you also have no option to like hold your hand traps for the other part, because the Fiendsmith deck is so good at making Appaloosa, right? So this makes Fiendsmith cards incredibly good into hand traps. What about board breakers? What about like if I can't stop them from making a board, how do I interact with it? Well, the Snake Eye board already was kind of good against board breakers, which is why people haven't been playing a whole lot of board breakers. I mean, there's been some approaches, especially after Baron and Savage were banned. Here's the unfortunate news. With Desiree, obviously Omni Negates are back, which is a big deal when you're playing a board breaker deck. It requires you to draw multiple sort of interactions, as well as if they have the ability to set up any form of a quick effect spell or trap, like a Set Wanted or a Blackout Laughs in the Graveyard or a Azaroon statue from Silhouette Rabbit. Even if you have a Dark Ruler, they can go Chainlink 2 Azaroon statue, Chainlink 3 Desiree, negate the Dark Ruler. So it's incredibly hard. The deck can be built in a very resilient way to board breakers, which is in part the fault of Beatrice, right? Because what people are doing at the moment in the TCG, they have a side deck that's prepared for going first, where you play cards like Angel of Blue Tears alongside some very powerful trap cards like Dimensional Barrier or Different Dimension Ground, or even just the Blackout Laughs, so that if your opponent is not playing hand traps but rather a board breaker approach and lets you combo, you can go into some really stupid combo lines that summon Beatrice and send one of those floodgates basically to the graveyard to make sure that even if they have a board breaker, you have a very powerful answer to that. I hope I was able to showcase how many different ways of impacting affecting the game they have, right? As starters, as extenders, as ways to pivot your combos with 2 bodies into the Fiendsmith cards, as ways to improve your end boards and all that kind of stuff. I simply don't think that an engine as complete as this one will simply be dealt with in one singular Forbidden Unlimited list. What I am hoping for is that they maybe change something about this sort of toolbox utility aspect, because the fact that this deck can do everything, I think, is a problem. What they could do, for example, is if they got rid of Beatrice, they would at least stop this engine from creating floodgates. If they banned Appaloosa, they would at least stop this engine from helping you play through all kinds of hand traps. If they banned Moon of the Closed Heaven, they would at least stop being able to go into this engine from any sort of 2 bodies, right? You now have to actually draw your Fiendsmith cards to play your Fiendsmith stuff. If they banned Papal Lurie, you would decrease the power of specifically tracked, and then you would have to think of other ways how you can get going with the Fiendsmith cards. So all of these individually would not get rid of the Fiendsmith cards. The Fiendsmith cards are going to be relevant for a while, and they're going to be an engine that is going to be in a lot of different decks. That is something that can be okay if they limit some of this. Like, it just can't do all of these things, right? Like, I think that's my takeaway. The Fiendsmith cards just do a little bit too much and are a little bit too versatile at pretty much no drawback. It's an engine that requires a decent bit of extra deck space, but that is literally the only downside. In terms of other stuff, they don't have a downside, right? They starters, extenders, end board pieces, consistency, all that good stuff. I hope this was helpful, and hopefully it was not too late. Let me know what you think of this kind of concept, this kind of video. I can do the same stuff about other archetypes in the future. Other than that, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace.